Great. Hi everyone, welcome to the Faith Impulse chat sponsored by ELCA Young Adults. This is a conversation hosted by the Young Adults Forum of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, specifically focusing this week on talking about faith, identity, and sexuality in the wake of the events in Orlando last Sunday evening. Members of this conversation that you see on the video screen to come, all of them are leaders in the Christian church. Some of them come from the ELCA. All of them are active in advocacy and outreach and activism for the LGBTQ community. And we're bringing together a number of voices tonight to discuss our thoughts, our laments, our hopes in the wake of the Orlando shooting, and where we hope the church and the world will go next. We'll open in prayer. Keisha, will you begin us in prayer?
Sure. We gather in this moment with the God of the present moment. And as we gather to reflect and remember and discuss together, we bring to our consciousness the people who were caught up in an incredibly violent experience in Pulse, Orlando, Florida, our LGBTQ, Latinx friends and loved ones. We hold them in this space as we discuss our own experiences and our hopes for the church at large. Thank you for being present with us, and may our conversation be clear and honest and vulnerable and truthful. Amen.
Amen. We'll begin tonight with introductions. Keisha, since you just prayed, thank you so much. Will you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Keisha McKenzie. I am a Seventh-day Adventist. I was born in London, college in Jamaica, lived in West Texas. Now I'm in Maryland, where I do communications with a Unity congregation not far from where I live. I've also had several years' experience working with the LGBT community in the Adventist context. Our affiliate group is called SDA Kinship International, and we have members who are in Orlando and a lot of people who have participated in activities at Pulse. And so this whole experience hits really close to home for a lot of us. And though nobody that I directly know was affected, but I went to work the following day and found my coworker was related to one of the people who passed away. Mm-hmm. So there are always within our community 1 to 2 degrees of experience, and so I'm here tonight and grateful for the opportunity to talk.
I am Padre Angel Marrero. I am a mission developer in the Boston, Massachusetts area. I work primarily with Latinos. This has been a very hard week. I'm young, I'm gay, I'm Latino, I'm Puerto Rican. The way I have expressed it to many other people that have asked me is that it has been a week in which I had hold my husband a little bit closer to me. And as we walk together, as we mourn together, it has been important for me to find groups of support like this one and to hear other voices that can mourn with me and walk together in this journey.
I'm Lawrence Richardson. I'm a United Church of Christ minister and digital evangelist and ministry consultant. I live in Minnesota, originally from Minnesota, so I haven't strayed too far yet, at least. And I am really interested in how our national discourse around acceptance for LGBTQ people, regardless of faith tradition, is engaged at this point in time because of the events in Orlando, and I look forward to engaging all of you as well.
Hi, my name is Ross Murray. I am the program director at GLAD, which is the nation's LGBT advocacy organization working on acceptance, primarily using the media as a tool for that level of acceptance. I run two programs at GLAD. One is related to the U.S. South, where Florida is one of the specific states that I have a focus on. And in about a week's time, we were planning a tour of the state with several of us on our staff, and that is now being revamped and changed. We weren't going to go to Orlando originally, but instead kind of be around it. And now, in light of what happened last week, want to make sure that that's someplace that we've put a lot of emphasis on, and that we can reshape the tour to look like that. The other program is global work. The other thing that I do is lead, found and direct a program called the Naming Project, which is an LGBTQ youth group that runs a summer camp as well. So later on this summer, a group of young people will be attending a camp too, and probably conversations about what's happening here will be bubbling up. And I'm in a strange spot. I just returned from vacation yesterday, and so the last week of vacation was me kind of feeling very guilty about being an experience where I'm trying to enjoy myself and yet knowing what's happening with my community, with communities that I very much care about, and also thinking about my coworkers who have been jumping in and working incredibly hard this last week and have been a little bit disconnected from that. I get a little work-oriented, and so I often tend to, think, what is it that we can do? That this is that there is great pain, there's great struggle, and there's also great opportunity that happens in moments of crisis like this as well. And that for a long time, our organization was often felt like we were often having to make the case for people that work for justice for LGBTQ people, and the breadth of LGBTQ people was not over. And yet, that common belief that if we get marriage equality, then somehow everything else just magically falls into place. And I don't want to be too perverse about it, but I do think that actions like this really do demonstrate to those people that are out there in that movable middle what work there is to do, and if something can come of it, it can be an understanding of where else we need to go, and that's what I'm hoping that can come out of such a horrible tragedy like this.
I am Natasha T. Miller. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, born and raised. I am a spoken word artist and a queer activist. When the incident in Orlando happened, I was actually in Daytona Beach for the Bahamas Symposium. And after I performed, I went to have dinner with one of the pastors, and she asked me, how did I feel about the South? How did I feel about Florida? And I said to her, this is one of the first times in my life that I felt unsafe on my travels, and this was before the shootings in Orlando, obviously just the night before, and I flew into Orlando and I flew out of Orlando. And then I woke up the next day and I had to perform again, and before I went on stage, I had all of these text messages from my family and friends back home just asking, like, are you safe? Are you safe? Are you safe? Were you there last night? And I didn't know what was happening. Then I got, on social media, got on the news, and I found out the news, obviously, like everyone else, and that fear was validated, which I didn't want to happen. I wanted to feel like maybe you're overthinking this life, this identity, all these things that you are and can be attacked for and are attacked for daily. And I've been to Pulse in Orlando. I've met friends at Pulse in Orlando, and like the rest of the world, I was shook and I was devastated, especially as a queer person of color. But more so than ever, this is one of the first times in, my life where I've been aware of what's happening, but I'm actually fearful, and not just for me, but for other, queer people, specifically queer people of color, because what I have learned over my years of being a queer person of color is that all of our spaces are being taken away from us. Like, there's not many safe spaces for us. And to mirror some of the sentiments of, my friends who were queer, who grew up in the club, that was for some of us more of a safe space than our own homes. Like, it felt like home when you would go to a club and see your friends living their lives and just being openly gay and feeling like you had nothing to worry about but maybe somebody stepping on your gym shoes. And now you're like, somebody's going to come in here and kill me. And then you go to the church as a person of color and you think about what happened in North Carolina and you think, wow, somebody's going to come in here and kill me. So I'm really just here to obviously join the community, join the conversation, progress the conversation, but to figure out where it is that we can feel safe and how we create those safe spaces for ourselves and for the youth.
My name is Aubrey Thonbold, and I am the executive director at Reconciling Works. And I've been here for 2 years, and it has been a journey in those 2 years to see what the organization does. On Friday, we celebrated our 42nd anniversary, and it amazes me that we have been an organization in ministry alongside the ELCA and other Lutheran denominations for 42 years, working for the full welcome, inclusion, and celebration of LGBTQ folks. Last week was an interesting time in our office. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, endless streams and calls from individuals and from congregations, just desperate for things to do. So we really partner with congregations and ministries. We also really worked with bishops quite a bit this last week, encouraging them to make public statements. And so if you go to Reconciling Works' Facebook page, you saw about 20 statements from our 65 ELCA bishops come out this past week in response to the tragedy, to the loss, to the murder. Like, I still don't know what to call it because it feels way too real and scary for it to be real. I don't know. So the tragedy that happened in Orlando. So
I am Pastor Margaret Kelly, and I am the pastor-developer of Shoby's Table, which is a Mission Start congregation in St. Paul, the St. Paul Area Synod in Minnesota. And I'm a queer person, I'm a queer woman, and but my heart aches as a mother right now. I am struggling most as a mother, knowing that it was particularly younger adults in a club, and looking at my daughter and knowing that I want her to go out into the world, to experience the world, to see what it has to give her, and being fearful of that, and reflecting that taking her to church may not always be safe, taking her to school will not always be safe, telling her that, yes, baby girl, you are white and have blonde hair, but that gives you a privilege in this world with police officers and first responders. And yet I struggle deeply with teaching that this is complex, and not knowing what to do in these moments of teaching and building her up in the baptismal promises that I take hope in, and my hope is she will as well. And I am to my detriment probably a hopeful person. I spend my time on the street with folks who experience violence on a daily basis and experience the difficulties of poverty on a daily basis. And so I am still taking it in that this happened, and still taking it in what I need to say into this world. And so my hope is to engage as a hopeful faith leader with others who need to find that promise of hope again.
I think I'm the last one. I'm Andrew Tobias Nelson. I'm an ELCA pastor serving in Chatham, New York. At my first call, I've been there about 2.5 years, and I'm half-time. The congregation is in the middle of a neighborhood where about every other yard has got a sign against the SAFE Act, which is trying to make gun safety a little more reasonable. And so it's a very strange space for me to be in as a genderqueer, transmasculine, bisexual, pansexual, whatever language fits for the day person. I'm also half-time working at Starbucks, which is a very different kind of community there, and much more instantly accepting of my queerness than the church tends to be, which is a struggle for me. I grew up in Northwest Ohio. I went to school in Indiana. I did my seminary studies in Chicago, and I didn't really come out to myself until I was in seminary, and I experienced an instant fear and anxiety over, oh God, I'm queer, now I've got to leave the church. But because I was in that community at that seminary and connected to people who were part of Proclaim, which is the professional network of LGBTQ seminarians and pastors and other rostered leaders in the ELCA, I found kind of this immediate support. And so I've kind of walked through this world with these rose-colored glasses and this assumption of safety, never having experienced bodily harm on account of my queerness, but in light of last Sunday and the number of my friends who from seminary and even from high school who reached out to see if I'm okay, has really reminded me that my biological family didn't ask any of those questions, and wondering, how my experience of relative safety has colored my way of looking at how connected we are and how we choose to stay connected, as opposed to geographically distancing ourselves, but the necessity of our taking care of each other across the distance, and recognizing each other and each other's pain and holding that space. Yeah.
Thank you all. And I am Reverend Emmy Kegler. I live in St. Paul. I serve in Minneapolis. So Margaret and Lawrence and Aubrey are all my neighbors in different ways. And I've just been called to a church in Northeast Minneapolis 2 months ago, so I've just begun my first call after graduating in 2014. What else should I say? And during the time between seminary and first call, I became really interested in the number of resources that are sort of scattered throughout the internet and throughout different books and textbooks about the intersection of LGBTQ life and Christian faith. And it occurred to me how many resources exist and yet how hard it is to find them, because simply typing in gay and Christian into Google doesn't necessarily return the kinds of supportive and welcoming and celebratory things that we want to provide, especially to teenagers who are struggling with to parents who are trying to understand their children. How do we bring together the number of resources and be able to say, here's a place that assumes a level of affirmation, but then allows you to explore a multitude of resources and ideas within that sort of safe space. So that's what I've been working on the past year with a project called Queer Grace, trying to continue the project of reclaiming that word queer as a term that encompasses a lot of different identities and sexualities, and to really reflect and offer that sort of welcoming resource. So that's one of the things that drew me to this conversation today. As we've been doing our intros, you all have started already touching on some of these points, but what do you want to offer up in just a few minutes for us to reflect on or think about faith, identity, and sexuality? Potentially in the wake of Orlando, if you had conversations this week that really encapsulate what that conversation is like on a broad scale, or what do you really want to start this conversation today with? Like, what is the nugget you want to really offer up before we begin our Q&A session? So as we did for intros, just jump in with whatever you want to share.
This is Lawrence Richardson. I will begin just by saying I'm transgender. For me, as a transgender person and also as a Christian minister, it's almost impossible for me to separate my faith identity from any of the other parts of myself. And so one of the things that I'm most interested in is how we can cultivate communities of faith where LGBTQ people can nurture their faith and evolve spiritually, so that we can all come to a greater and better understanding of human identity and also human sexuality. I also believe that a lot of what we are now seeing in response to the marriage equality, all of the laws and states that are popping up, these proposed legislations that restrict the rights of LGBTQ people, I believe is a direct result of people's informed faith and how their religious understanding impacts the decisions that they make. And I believe that we also, as people of faith, need to be reminded that there is a separation between church and state, and that it is that way for a reason. We are one nation under God, and we all have differing experiences with God and how we relate to God. And I don't believe that any one group or one person and their religious beliefs should inform the laws that govern our society. And yet somehow we come back to this conversation about LGBTQ people and how that does or does not relate to a person's religious understanding or their beliefs about God. And so I'm interested in trying to figure out how we can, as people of faith, nurture these communities and spaces that are safe, but also that encourage LGBT people to have spiritual relationships, however that is played out in whatever religious identity they take on or don't take on. I believe that still having space to do that is important, while also not assuming that every person of faith believes along the same lines and therefore should support the same kinds of things in as far as legislation and politics are concerned. So we do need to have safe spaces. We also need to figure out how to live together in spaces with people who may not agree with who we are or how we live, but also still can commit to maintaining dignity and integrity and making sure that just human rights and civil rights are values that are upheld in every aspect of how we live together. But for me, there is no separation of faith and how I live. So my values have to come out in how I live. And that also means, though, that I need to figure out for myself how my message, and I can't remember who said it earlier, but how my message in the world is now impacted because of events like Orlando and also because of events like Charleston. I believe it's also impossible to separate race from this. A large group of people of color in a club, in a space that they found sanctuary, killed by another person of color. And I think that the understanding of how LGBTQ people are received in especially groups, religious groups of color, is also a dynamic that needs to be lifted up as well. I believe that there just needs to be a lot more conversation about human sexuality, how it relates to faith, how it's played out in our daily lives, and how we take the messages of our churches into our politics.
I think about, in the context of the work that we do at Reconciling Works, something that I have found for myself is that as a lesbian, as a wife, right, I think about the way that the church chooses or chooses not to talk about LGBTQ folks. And I think about in situations and in places where we think about the work that we've done. In a lot of spaces I hear reference to 2009, right? In 2009, when the ELCA decided and voted to let gay and lesbian clergy be partnered, right? I think about that time in our church's history, and I hear some people say that with a voice of celebration, and I hear some people say that with a voice of fear and just tiredness. And I think about how our church, if we had better muscle memory and had better practice about talking about queer people and their bodies, it wouldn't feel so hard or divisive when moments like this come up. I also was just recently invited by Albert Starr, who's the director of multicultural ministries and ethnic-specific ministries at the ELCA, to attend the Multicultural Leadership Summit that the ELCA held. And I walk around in white skin, right? And I know that. And I went to this group conversation with people of color, and my heart just broke open. Like, I would call my wife crying sometimes at night, because I was like, man, the struggle in the church for people who are marginalized is so real and so big. And so how do we really start living into holding the church accountable to remembering that we are the body of Christ together? We are church together for the sake of the world, and that we cannot exclude those that are easy to marginalize because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, or the color of their skin, because it's hard to be challenged and to be told that you are an oppressor for one reason or another, right? But all of us, in the midst of all that we are simultaneously an oppressor and the oppressed. And it's about living in that tension of how do we be true to our identities and true to the gospel message, which I cling to with all of my being, that is about faith, hope, and love, right?
I'm in a unique position in my call as a mission developer and as a pastor in the ELCA. I think that it's fair to say 7 years ago in 2009, you would not have expected the queer pastor in St. Paul to be the poster child during the Synod Assembly videos, right? Shoby's Table has been identified as a ministry that is worth being celebrated and held up within the ELCA. We have a food truck, and people are excited about that. I'd say we are going back to our roots. Jesus prayed and fed people. That's what he did. And that is what we do at Shoby's Table. We hang out with the people and we eat and we pray. And so to be a queer woman, there is no secret that I have a wife and a daughter, that we are a rainbow family. So on the one hand, I am hopeful, right? They have used what they see as good ministry and are willing to put that out there. The flip side of this is as a mission developer, I have to find my funding. And I have to go out with partner congregations all over the Synod and all over my regional area. And what do I say when the youth group from Little Falls, Minnesota shows up in a group of 20 kids? They're adults, they're pastors, and what do I say when they ask, well, what's your family like? Like, tell me what your husband does. Do I change that now? Do I change how I talk about my family? And the real fear that there is in introducing who I am with integrity to these congregations that are part of supporting this ministry that I do, that is not explicitly about queer folks. It's about people in the socioeconomic margins, which does include queer people, but particularly people in economic poverty. And so this week, on Thursday, we worship on Thursdays, this group from Little Falls comes. And I got my courage, and I talked about Orlando, and I realized, again, like I do many weeks and many days, that my responsibility as the person with privilege in the room, the person who carries both the privilege and power and burden of ordination, is to speak into that, right? And to speak to these young people and say, this is what this is about. This is about brokenness in God's world. This is about us losing hope. This is about us losing connection to one another and remembering that we are baptized children of God. We have forgotten who we are. We have forgotten that we are beloved. And when we remember that we are beloved, we stop killing each other, right? We stop maiming each other. And we remember that we are called into this body together. So my deep hope, and I join in my brothers and sisters here, my deep hope is that we will remember that our name is beloved child of God. But all the rest of it, those are details. But beloved child of God is who we are, and my hope is that we remember how to do that together.
You know, I would say on Sunday, you know, post Orlando, when we all got up and we went to church, a lot of us were probably, you know, at home in our cars, and we were thinking, is the bishop, is the pastor going to speak about what happened last night or not? And I feel like that's because the LGBTQ lifestyle is still the alternative in the church. It's still like, maybe he will, maybe she will, maybe she won't, maybe we'll create these safe spaces after the tragedy, when in reality, these safe spaces need to exist before the tragedy, and we need to find a way to integrate this queerness and this blackness and this transness into everyday life in the church and not make it the alternative. So on Sunday when we got up, we should have all felt safe knowing that when we go to church, whoever is leading the sermon that Sunday is absolutely going to speak about what happened in Orlando. But like I said, it's still a if, because it's not integrated into everyday life, and that's not going to happen until I feel like the churches are comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like, it's going to take for us to go into, you know, our church homes and say, yo, these conversations are going to make you uncomfortable. This programming is going to make you uncomfortable. And until the people who are in control, you know, of the sermons, of the word, of the messages, of the programming feel uncomfortable with us integrating this into everyday life, I feel like no one is going to feel completely safe. So I'm here to try to figure out once again, how this cannot be the alternative conversation. This can be the conversation that is present every single day, of our lives, in our churches, and in our faith.
I think right now we're at a point where there's this attempt to try to define whatever the narrative that comes out of Orlando is going to be. And I think the great thing I've heard in the conversation here so far is it's very much a yes and thing. I keep thinking about this too, is that this in one respect, I see a lot of people that try to marginalize or separate out the identities of the people who were victims in the attack, and try to deny LGBT people with that, or try to deny that people of color were in the attack, deny kind of what this community that was gathered, who they were, and that entire complexity for them too. And I feel like we as a church, and we as leaders within the church in this conversation, the people watching, can be a part of shaping what that narrative is. I think as an ELCA, we've done a lot of work on ourselves and on our denomination, and on ourselves as an institution, and on our congregations, and I've been really proud of that work. And what I've seen at GLAD, because our stuff is so much about the media and about narrative, is that there's then this public thing. There is, how do we feel about ourselves? How do we define who we are? But then there's, how are we being viewed in the world? How are we engaging out into the wider world as well? And I think that the way that we preach, the way that we offer prayers, the way that we talk and engage with people, being a part of our church, being a part of our leadership, does help to identify all of these struggles that this Orlando tragedy, all of the struggles that were kind of wrapped up in that tragedy. So we're talking about someone. Is this about terrorism? Is this about racism? Is this about homophobia? Is this about transphobia? Is this about access to guns? Is this about a blood ban that still doesn't let people be able to help folks within their own community? And you have to say yes to all those things, and probably so much more from what I've just listed. And I think anything that tries to take any of that piece out ignores what the larger narrative is. And I think that we have to be that reminder, because we're doing this as people who believe in a God that is so much bigger and broader than the ideas and categories and ways that we sort and organize the world around us. And so as we keep putting in that yes and yes and understanding what this narrative is, I think that's how we can shape what our culture is going to be like, and what our culture, what we're going to find acceptable, and how we're going to find solutions to make sure that things like this don't happen in, in an LGBT nightclub on Latino night in the theme park capital of the world, which is one of the ways I've heard this described. And I think that it will make sure that it can keep safe wherever the next tragedy is going to occur, and to perhaps mitigate or prevent or make our society even better at taking care of our own. And that's what I hope. That's what I hope can come of this. I think that there's a really strong narrative, and this is a part now of our American history, and we have a responsibility to make sure that this history is told in the fullest and most complex way possible. And I think that that's what faith leaders do, and that's what I hope that we can be a part of.
One of the things that burdens me about the way that a lot of conversations have been happening around Orlando is that the human element has been stripped out. And part of that is that there are so many interests, whether it's media or nonprofit organizations, to organize and take action and capture the moment and all of that. And yet at the heart of this experience are 49 unique individuals, and as many wounded, and their families, and their co-workers, and their relatives, and those are the core of the story. And it almost hurts to discuss it in the absence of centering the human element. When I heard about and saw the names and heard and discovered more details about their lives, one of the things that struck me was just the deep vulnerability of it all, that if I, as a bi/fluid woman, were to do all the self-actualization work I can do, I find myself a rare affirming Adventist church, or I find myself another congregation in another denomination that I can participate at. It doesn't matter if I go to a pride event and somebody else who I have no impact or control over decides that I am a threat or I am an outsider. They have the ability to harm me, just as somebody decided that he had the authority and the ability to harm these beautiful, beautiful souls. We can take all the organized, progressive action we can as a community, and yet the fact that, as Natasha mentioned, that we are rendered the alternative, we are rendered the outsider, the marginal, the inferior, that itself creates this kind of, this almost overwhelming threat to our security, our freedom, our liberty, our ability to flourish, that I think we have to reckon with. I think there's almost an element of denial in the movement about how deep that is. Trans people of color are experiencing it already and have for many, many years, experiencing the brunt of the violence of the mainstream system that says that as a non-cisgender person, you are not fit to live. That is like something that as a community we have to accept and reckon with in order to talk about what the future looks like, in order to say with any grounded sense of reality that we can have hope. Well, how can we have hope when we are that vulnerable? We have to be able to talk about that. And that was something that as I woke up on Sunday morning and went to work, not at my usual community. I usually attend church on Saturday. And so I didn't have the experience of wondering whether my immediate pastors would address it, although there was a lot of absence and silence. But I just felt that sense of vulnerability, that even if I did everything, quote unquote, right, I found my place, I found my safety, I found my sanctuary, somebody else could violate it. I'm still feeling that.
I think that I come with conflicted feelings. On the one hand, I stand in this beautiful churches and I preach this message about liberation and forgiveness of sins, and I go do confirmation classes, and everywhere I go with these symbols of my office, I am revered in the, at least in the Boston area, and people open doors, and here I am representing an institution that has for years, for millennia, fostered unsafety and theological thoughts that kills people, that eventually ends in bloodshed. And I am sick and tired of the church, of my church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, of my tradition, liberal Lutheranism, washing its hands away from its responsibility, from fostering these attitudes, from trying to cover it all up and they're all humans, we're all the same, without really talking about what you were talking, the individuality and the values that individual people have. So I come here and want to bring this conflict to all of you. How do we feel like we belong to an institution that on the one hand nourishes us, on the one hand offers the presence of Christ for you and for me, and on the other hand also fosters all sorts of hates against us and against so many others?
For a tradition that worships an incarnate God, we have no idea how to honor human bodies. It's the argument that we've had for ages about how can Christ be divine, how can God experience pain and still be God. We have this struggle with wanting to be good and perfect and righteous, and somehow that means we disassociate from our bodies and from our lived experience and from our sexuality, and we've got these clear expectations and roles for the binary gender system within this colonizing institution. That the Christ that we worship knows what it's like to have skin on, and yet and chose that freely, right? Had all the power in the universe to create the universe, and still chose to be vulnerable to splinters and stubbed toes and heartache, and those are the very things that we deny when we're trying to attain holiness and talk about forgiveness, as though the choice that God made to become flesh is anathema, as though the choice that God made to walk with feet and grow hair and weep tears is something that we think is not good enough for us or for God. And the experience of being embodied, and the experience of living into our human sexuality, puts us in such a vulnerable position. But if we're not vulnerable, how do we learn love, and how do we learn care, and how do we learn to build that beloved community in the rich and deep way that it's meant to be rooted in life? And Jesus lived that openly, and we killed him for it because we couldn't handle it. We couldn't handle that kind of openness and wholeness and that encompassing of the entirety of what it means to be alive. We cut that part of ourselves off constantly. And I think the LGBTQ community is a reminder of the joy and the beauty and the possibility of being fully embodied people, and the rest of the culture can't handle taking that kind of risk. Can't handle, looking at life and death and the struggle to live every day honestly and openly and fully. We have a great intellectual tradition of wrestling with texts, and we do so without loving the people that our words so deeply affect. Like I said in my introduction, I never experienced any physical altercations on account of my gender presentation or my sexuality. Not that I was really allowed to have a sexuality growing up in the Midwest in the church, because I was the good kid, and the good kids don't do that in the church, was the underlying message. So when I first came out as queer, I thought that I had lost the church and that whole community. But in that same instant, I connected with God in a way that I had never been able to before. And we just don't have the option to cut ourselves apart and expect to be able to live. We just don't have that option. And our lived experience of loving in a world that tells us that we can't, that's Christ. And that's our gift to the faith. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Natasha.
No, I was just going so going in and out. I was just gonna say, like, just to kind of not really give an answer, but a response to the original question. I feel like we have to wake up every day and make this spiritually conscious effort to remember that this God that we serve is so much bigger than the mistakes that we make within the church. and also make this effort to forgive ourselves and forgive other people that we are directly involved with, especially in the church. And that's not always easy, but if we can always get to the end, which is forgiveness, then we can get to the beginning of understanding each other and helping navigate each other, through this life and this spirituality. And I know that the church is so big, and our God is so big, and sometimes as much as the church is giving to us all, we feel like in our personal lives it's taking away from us. But I feel like, once again, if we can just remember that we serve something that's so much bigger, and that we are doing God's work, and that we are doing good work, and there are people in the church that are trying, but unless we can find that forgiveness for each other and that understanding for who we all are and what we're all trying to be in this world, we're obviously not going to get anywhere. But I feel like it is important, once again, like I said, to call out the church, to say that you're not creating a safe space and make you uncomfortable until that safe space is created, but to always remember that who we're serving is so much bigger than anything else that we'll serve by walking away from the church or disassociating ourselves from it. And just understanding that even in this thing that's so good to us all and so good for us all, there are still mistakes to be made, because we're all still human at the end of the day.
Thank you, everyone. We'll be moving now into a Q&A portion. We've had some questions coming in through Twitter. Those of you who are watching along at home, you can tweet using the hashtag FaithImpulse if you want to ask questions of the group. Questions that have been coming in, and a lot of what's been surfacing in our reflections already, have been around safe spaces and how do we create them, how do we sustain them, how do we help churches who are not ready to create them begin the steps into creating them. This makes obviously a lot of sense, considering that maybe the last safe space for the GLBT community was in clubs. After we had found no safe space in our schools and in our homes and our families and our churches, that was the last safe space, and now that too has been taken from us. So as these questions are coming in talking about safe space, I'm wondering if the collective wisdom of the group can answer, maybe with concrete examples and stories. What does a safe space look like? How does a safe space get created? And how can it be started in a place that is not yet safe? So if you have stories or concrete thoughts about first steps in those, let's start there.
I would say that as a minister and as a new church developer, a past new church developer, it's really difficult to create safe space in churches that are not already safe spaces. And what I mean by that is, if there's no public declaration made that this is a safe space for people that are LGBTQ, people that are somehow otherwise marginalized, it's going to be difficult to convince people that that space is safe. And unless there are people at the table that are a part of the decision making to make that a safe space, and people at the table who represent the communities that are welcomed there, it'll be difficult to have any kind of effort truly resemble what it will take to become a safe space. An example that I have is, I was a part of a new mission development in a church that had not yet taken a vote to welcome LGBTQ people, and we were specifically an LGBT group of people. And so we were then invited to their cabinet meetings to share personal stories, things that we would look for, things that would suggest that this was a safe space, in addition to more than just like a rainbow flag, right, and then a sign that says all are welcome. But what are the messages that we look at, and how are people depicted? How are couples represented? How is diversity displayed in the church? And these are all things that communities can begin to look at themselves, and then also really taking an intentional look at how the message of God, the gospel, is being shared through that church into the community, and how the community is benefited from the presence of the church. I feel like a lot of times churches look at how they themselves benefit from welcoming certain types of people. And I feel like the church should now start to ask the question how the community at large is benefited from the presence of the church in that community. And if your community is really preaching the gospel and ministering to all, then we should be able to easily answer how that looks, and how that's displayed and perpetuated throughout the messages and messaging of the church.
I'll jump in to say that at Reconciling Works, one of the programs that we offer is the Reconciling in Christ program. So the organization's been around for 42 years, and the Reconciling in Christ program has been around for 32. And over those 32 years, we've really worked to create a way for congregations to learn how to engage in conversations that feel authentic to where individual congregations are, about how do we really explicitly and intentionally welcome LGBTQ folks, and how do we name them in a welcome. We have a lot of congregations that have reached out to us, or we reach out to them, or we cross paths with them, and they're like, we don't need to become reconciling in Christ. We say all are welcome. And as a lesbian woman, when someone says all are welcome, I don't assume that means me, because church has not always been a safe place for me, even when someone says all are welcome. And so we at Reconciling Works have partnered with 12 other of our mainline Protestant ecumenical partners to create a toolkit, and it's called Building an Inclusive Church. And it's a training that we offer for congregations for the simple and low cost of hospitality. And we offer that to congregations, and it teaches 4 different tools. And one of the biggest ones is graceful engagement, where how do we talk about individuals in a way that we name them as God's beloved, right? And that title and that name given to them by the divine is not up for argument or debate, right? We don't get to fight about if I'm worthy of being able to sit in your pew, because God has already called me beloved and said, yes, you come sit with me. Right, so we walk congregations through those four tools that we offer, and then there's 11 different steps. Right now we have 668 congregations who are wearing the RIC title, and we know that for some of them have been RIC for 30 years. And it's not just something where like you get your certificate in the mail and then you hang it on your church wall and you're like, woohoo, we're done, right? But it's about how do we continuously live into what is different and what is new, because I think about, even just the time in my life since I've come out, how different LGBTQ folks talk about our identity and share ourselves with the world in ways that are more liberated than I experienced 10 years ago. So it's always about being invited into, continuously living into, and engaging with folks in that RAC status.
I'll jump in to add too. I've done some of that similar work with the Reconciling Christ programs, working with Reconciling Works, and I have found that toolkit's been really helpful, and the training's been really helpful, not only for the explicit welcome of LGBTQ people, of which it's intended for, but also has become a really good guide that congregations use when they're making decisions, when they're trying to figure out who else is not feeling welcome, or who is being excluded intentionally or unintentionally, and kind of doing that self-audit and realizing that the intersectional approach, that isn't there, but that can give them a method for identifying those things and thinking about steps about how they can make themselves really authentic. I've always said that people can feel very unwelcome in a church that names itself as welcoming, and people can feel incredibly welcomed in a place that has never done anything. It is very much someone's experience when they walk through the door, and the hardest part is how do we get someone to actually walk through the door? How do we let people experience that welcome even if they're not going to come near the building or the space or the program that we've set up? And I think that it's going to be really important for us to include and pepper and use within our conversation within the way that we talk about how we engage as a church, as a congregation, as a denomination, and those are going to be really important tools. But I do think the toolkit that Aubrey referenced has been really helpful that for creating this intersectional approach of congregation decision making, congregation identity, letting people know what our strengths and what our identity is. All our congregations are going to be very different from each other, and that's good, and it needs to be that way. We need to be focused. We need one place to have really great great music, and one place to have really great education, and one place to have really great things for families. And those things fit together in a combination of ways because it is just as rich and diverse as the kingdom of God is. And we want to create communities that can that can help express that diversity as well. And I think figuring that out comes from who we are as a people.
One of the things I encourage ministers that I'm speaking to and organizations that are working on this question would be first to define what they mean when they say safe space. Because I often think that there are two things being conflated, or maybe just not necessarily teased out. One would be harm reduction. From the institutional level, an organization can often say they want to be a safe space, but they haven't yet committed to being nonviolent, which is a more assertive and active way of being. So they can say they want to be safe, but they haven't committed to language that deliberately and assertively includes the people that are in the room, or they haven't decided that they need their policies to be reconfigured so that they can invalidly assert that they are nonviolent in their approach to people. So that's on the institutional level, but as an individual, I'm not looking for a safe space, I'm looking for a space where I can flourish. So I could be in a space that's safe, where I'm not being physically attacked, but I don't have room to grow, I don't have room to participate. And so as an individual, I'm looking for something that's, beyond not being attacked and beyond not being isolated and beyond not having nasty sermons thrown at me on Saturday or Sunday morning. I want a space where as an individual, as a unique expression of God, I can flourish. And so when we're talking about safe spaces, are there ways that we can ensure that the definitions we're using address that spectrum of experience, whether it is merely we're talking about reducing harm from an institutional authority, or we're saying here's a place where individuals, whatever your experiences and demographic categories, can flourish. And so I was part of a project last spring called Enough Room at the Table in the Adventist context, where we were talking about what does it take to get towards flourishing. And part of that was frank discussions about language. And often that's a very easy place to start with a minister. If you're at a specific local congregation and you want to start talking about improving your quality of experience there, maybe having a sit down with the ministerial team and saying, here are some of our preferred terms, and this is why they're important to us. And can we agree that we're gonna use them as a community? And that helps to set a stage for mutually respectful conversation, without which you cannot get to the other stages about who can participate or who can't. And so if we can have a common understanding of the language that we're using, that's really helpful. Perhaps in the Elca community, you've passed that stage maybe. But for a lot of communities, that's not, you haven't even got there yet. So that would be where I would start, with language.
Great, thank you. As we're continuing, we're getting in more questions that sort of nuance that idea of safe space. So, and a couple of questions that are coming in are getting at the same idea. One from Casey Klein says, how do we move from making safe space, and she uses it in quotations, and says requiring assimilation, to stepping aside so that our LGBTQ plus siblings lead and teach us? And there's another question coming in also, why do we only hold safe space once a tragedy happens? And I think that's how do we kick off that dangerous conversation, or those uncomfortable conversations, as Natasha has said a couple times? How do we help people move into being uncomfortable, even proactively before a tragedy happens?
I think it goes back to really assessing a congregation's mission, vision, values. What benefit are they adding to the community at large? How are they impacting the world for God? It's, when you seek to glorify God in everything that you do, there is harm reduction, right? There is safe space. There is listening and compassion. The fruits of the Spirit are present when a congregation is truly rooted and grounded in God and seeking after the Spirit to be that placeholder in society where work of God can happen through that church. I think that part of the answer is spiritual renewal. I think a lot of our churches exist as clubs or social organizations and not necessarily as communities of faith tasked with the message of the gospel and the healing of nations. And if we go back to what I believe the church is really created for, it's not to serve us, but it's to serve the world, it's to serve God, then I think that we'll get closer to figuring out how we can live with being uncomfortable. And remember that Jesus Christ was uncomfortable many times and yet still managed to preach and teach the gospel to all of the people that he encountered, and still managed to love and feed all of the people that we read about in the gospels. So I feel like once we get out of our own way and realize that it's not about us, it's about the gospel, it's about God, it's about the love of God manifested in the world, that we'll be okay being uncomfortable. Because if our job is to bring the kingdom of God here on earth, we wouldn't have this discussion, and we wouldn't have trouble trying to figure out how to be welcoming and loving and affirming of all people.
Yeah, and one of the quickest ways to make people feel uncomfortable is to make them feel like they're going to be held accountable for something. And we talked about accountability early on. So I feel like one of the first steps in having this conversation is going to the people who feel unsafe right now and saying, what do you need? What makes you feel unsafe? And letting us say, these are the things that we need. These are the things that make us feel unsafe. And these are the things we're going to hold you accountable for. And once people feel like they're going to be held accountable for the things that they do right here on this earth, then I feel like we can progress the conversation and move past just safe space and a space, like you said, where you can actually flourish. Because I don't want to wake up every day and feel like, oh my God, I'm going to church today. This is a safe space. I don't even want to have to think about it. I just want to wake up and go and wake up and be. And I'm most comfortable in spaces being and going and doing when I feel like people are being held accountable for their actions. And in the church, these people who make us feel unsafe have to be held accountable for their actions, and we have to foster these conversations with people, like I said, who feel unsafe. What is it that we need, and how do we get to grabbing and grasping the things that we need?
In that sense, I think that as a church leader, first and foremost, we need to cut the bullshit. And we need to start speaking the truth to ourselves. And here, the Lutheran law theology may be a little bit of help. Our churches are not safe spaces. Our synods are not safe spaces. Our denomination is not a safe space. We cannot even approach the conversation until we make the confession of our sin. Even in the places that we say are safe, even the ones we sometimes put the safe name and the safe flag or whatever, they aren't. And I say it as a leader of the church, as somebody that went through candidacy, as somebody that has dealt with bishops, that has gone to church-wide events. Until we can recognize that these spaces aren't safe, I don't think we can move. I don't think we can move if we can until we can do that very basic level of recognition of what's wrong among us.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Kishu,
Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say it. That's real talk. What helped me was to disconnect my local congregational experience from my broad identity with my denomination, because you don't really have a person-to-person connection with the denomination. It's thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people in hundreds of thousands of different contexts. Where you live and move is often first in the local congregation, or if you're an employee, the spaces that you named, the synod or the administration of the denomination. But that too is an experience that's mediated with real people. It's not like an abstract thing. That's a human connection, and often people hide behind their institutional positions and their labels and stuff like that. And at the core of it is my ability as a human being to connect with you, regardless of your institutional position, regardless of your title, and whatever coverage that denomination provides you. But I still have the right, and I still assert my value as an equal human being to you and an equal child of God to you. And so I have to say, despite the context that we're in, how can I insist, as Natasha says, that I'm accountable to you and you are accountable to me? Because a lot of the conversations that we're having where we're saying, yes, we have to center the people who feel unsafe right now, all of that assumes that the community is willing to stay in relationship with us. And sometimes the communities aren't willing to say that we're willing to stay in relationship with you because they're still disciplining people, or they're still expelling people, or they're still squeezing people out. So at the very root of it is a commitment to community that I don't think is always there. But it has to be there for us to even really talk about safety and being real and being vulnerable over time. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, of course. Keisha and Angel, as just reflecting on what the two of you have just been talking about, and really all of us talking about creating those spaces of discomfort and pushing back on systems of systemic sin, pushing back on hiding in institutions. What do we do to start that process? What do either we do as members of the LGBT community? What do our allies and our advocates do from positions of power or positions of support within the communities? Where do we start in naming our wrongs?
I don't know if there's one place to start. I feel like there are multiple places, that you can start. And as we discussed earlier, there's a lot to take in with this conversation. And there's so many angles that you have to address in our own churches, in our own homes, in our own friendship circles. We got to figure out, one at a time what conversation we want to start, while somewhere else another conversation is being started, and we all have the same common goal. But as we discussed earlier, when it comes just the admittance of, like you said, systemic sin, of saying this is not a safe space, of taking those rainbow flags down in front of the church and then actually on a sermon board saying this is not a safe space, admitting to the world, but we're trying to create this safe space. And those are the things that are going to make you uncomfortable, make the people who are riding past your church uncomfortable, but also honest and say, like, yep, like this is not truly here for you, this is not truly safe for you, but I promise you we are trying, and we need you to come in and help us and tell us what it is we can do to make you feel safe, to make ourselves, a safer space. So I think, like I keep saying, it's different conversations to be had in different spaces, but make sure you are fostering these conversations, that you are asking, yourself, not others, what you need, and sparking up those conversations within your own church homes, within your own friendship circles, within your own homes.
I also think it's important to have some of these initial conversations before you invite people in. What I mean by that is, if it's a predominantly white congregation, for example, talking about how to be welcoming to people of color, there's some conversations you should have before you invite people of color to the table. And I say that because even the ones that are, those of us who are trained and do this work of inclusion and diversity, there are some things that we can't teach, and there are some things that we can't share or show. In a conversation about whiteness, a conversation about privilege, a conversation about systemic oppression, those are things that I think need to be had by dominant groups, churches, before different kinds of people are welcomed into the space. Because it's one thing to say, what do you want? And it's another thing to say, teach us how to be nice to you. And I feel like we need to learn how to distinguish those two things. People of color especially are invited into spaces to help those people become more inclusive, but at the same time, those people don't understand who they are. And when I say those people, whoever is the inviting group of people, not necessarily one dominant group over another, but when you extend an invitation, really understand who are you inviting to the table, and are you going to be delaying the conversation by first trying to get at how we can just sit down and first have the conversation and talk to each other before any of the issues get started. And I feel like there's so much work that communities of color need to do also within their own spaces. And when someone does invite a group of color or a group of LGBTQ people to the table to say, what do you want? Really having that list of things that you do want so that you can say, these are our needs, this is what would make this space safe. So I think work needs to happen on both sides before that table is co-created.
And as part of that work, I believe that in a denominational level, and I'm here only speaking of my tradition, the ELCA, I would love to see something similar to the conversations we had about our complicity in, to mention the classic example, in the Holocaust, how our theological tradition was complicit and how our hands are stained with the blood that was spilled by our ancestors. And similarly, our hands in this tradition, in Christianity, in the ELCA, it is stained by the blood of this, for example, Orlando martyrs. And how awesome it would be, how much of a goodwill thing would be to see an expression that is similar, a declaration from the denomination to the LGBTQ community, speaking about the ways in which it has been oppressive through its candidacy systems, for example, through not allowing LGBTQ leaders in positions of power, through tokenizing LGBTQ leaders in this church, and through using us at many times to get points for diversity, because after all, this is the liberal church and we look very pretty in the magazine covers and in the ads and in Senate assemblies, but it's not so good when it's time to make to be present in the decision table. Those things, I think, could be great to further down the conversation.
There are two memorials that I know of that were working their way through Synod assemblies addressing our ancestors' role in systemic racism. One around the Native American culture and what it was like, and what role white people in the ELCA and like descendants of those folks who are now in the ELCA played in that. And then also there's a memorial from the African descent talking about the role that white people played in slavery. And I think that for as young adults in the ELCA, there is a lot of church politics that happen where I think if we put our voices in those places, we could be game changers. We could be game changers if we showed up the same way that folks who are a generation or two older than us show up. I think that we could shake our church in some really fantastic and exciting ways.
We have a question that goes in a slightly different direction, but is still kind of following in that that question about how do you start a safe space. My church, LCMS, hasn't talked about or mentioned Orlando. How would you recommend I approach this as a young person?
My feedback would be very similar to pretty much anyone, which would be to start local. I know the LCMS is a much more theologically hostile community to LGBTQ people, and that creates a climate where it's much more difficult for local congregations, ministers, and others who care about the community to make it less violent. There's a default there, as in my denomination, there's a default of violence. And so in that context, I would not encourage anybody who's vulnerable to start with the denomination. I would encourage them to start with their local community, the place where they live, breathe, work, and connect with others. That's the space where people actually have already seen them as a human being, made eye-to-eye contact with them, that's the space where you have much more leverage, much more ability to challenge, to share your experience, to share your story, to share your concerns. And so that would be my recommendation, not to go about with the denomination itself, but address your local experience, because that's where it will mean more to you, where you actually live.
I would second that starting locally and talking from your own experience and thoughts and feelings are, and I realize that again for the LCMS that there are some ways and places that people have to, things they have to do to be able to protect themselves, and in order to get a word, to do something with a community where you have a relationship, people that know you and love you and have expressed that in some way, and that may be within their own congregation, it may be somewhere outside of it as well, and recognizing that there is, again, going back to someone's own personal safety, and also the need to be able to speak up and be that prophetic word, and having to weigh that for what someone's able to do for themselves. But knowing that when you're speaking to people that you have a relationship with, that you have a history with, that deepens things much further and can allow you to share your thoughts and feelings with folks, especially as it relates to the violence that people have been witnessing, the news that has been coming out, what that means for us as a church, what that means for us as a country, what that means for us as a world. There are a lot of different approaches that can happen there, but I think that when people know you, then there's a people want to be more pastoral. Whether or not they can live up to that is something else, and I want to make sure that I'm not making claims for what someone else can do, but that's the way to start. And if someone doesn't think that's the safe space in which to do it, then making sure that you know and can find other communities, other resources that are able to offer that same care and protection for you. And that could be the people that are on this call. It can be people that are in your hometown, to make sure that you have that space, even if it cannot be your own congregation.
And we all know that, age-old saying, strength is in numbers. Even when you step outside of the community and find, others within your local community, you can find people in your church that feel the same way that you feel, that you can identify with. And I say from there, you just organize and you strategize. I'm a poet, so I'm never going to give you the safest advice. I'm just like, yo, go wherever and say whatever you want to say. And that can be dangerous at times. So if you need me to come, I'll do that for you. But I say you go and you find people that you identify with within the church as well. And you strategize, to the best of your abilities, and you do come to other people that you identify with outside of your church home, and you ask for that help, and you don't be afraid to ask for that help, and whatever it is that we can do or that those people in your local community can do, I'm sure they will.
We have another question that I think is a really good way to end as we're coming to the close of our time together. What does wholeness mean in faith when the church is so divisive but also so hope-giving sometimes? What is, when we're talking about wholeness and flourishing, what does that look like? What does that feel like? How do we create those spaces that take us that step further?
When I came out, it was really interesting to be a part of the congregation that I was a part of. It was an ELCA congregation, and to kind of watch them slowly become uncomfortable with me. And I was like, fine, if you're going to become uncomfortable with me, then I'm uncomfortable with you. And I left the church for about 3 years. But there was a part of me that was missing, because as much as my queer identity is a part of who I am, my faith is a part of who I am. And it's about being in community and reconciling how to be able to be in both. And my wholeness lives in that place where I get to be unapologetically a lesbian woman in the midst of being unapologetically ELCA Lutheran. Do I get that all the time? No. Do I get that sometimes? Yeah. And in those moments when I get it, I try to soak it all in and let it live in me for as long as it can.
I think that wholeness is when nothing is missing and nothing is broken, where if there is some sort of wounding that happens, that opportunities for repair and reconciliation are possible, that every single person in a particular community has the same opportunity for the advancement and thriving and abundance, and that there is no part of you that has to be left behind in order to be in relationship, that you are honored and loved for all of who you are.
For me, I come back to St. Mark. And in the Gospel of Mark, we have a baptismal story and a transfiguration story. And there was some point last year when I was reading through Mark and I saw, wait, these are mirroring each other. And I'm sure plenty of other people have had that moment before, but for me, it was my first moment of sitting there with the Gospel of Mark and saying, wait, if we are baptized into a baptism like Jesus, and receive those words at baptism, this is my beloved child with whom I am well pleased. And at transfiguration, Jesus hears again, you are my beloved, listen to him. We are commanded to listen to God in Christ Jesus, to hear that we are beloved children, that can never be taken away. And because of many misconceptions about the community I serve people living in poverty, folks who struggle with addiction and mental illness, people who are homeless, people who are on the verge of being homeless. And I've been asked, well, you're just in this to change people. I say, no, I'm in it so people hear and believe that they are transfigured, that they are who God has called them to be. So for me, wholeness means being transfigured into who God has called you to be in this world. Now, that means for hard conversations, right? Because when you are who God has called you to be, you become a prophet, you become a preacher, you become a teacher, and all those things. But wholeness is being transfigured into that baptismal identity.
Wholeness to me, it means that you're one all the time and you're never taking off pieces of yourself. And when you go home to your love, you don't take off your church, and when you go into the church, you don't take off your love, and when you go into your work, you don't take off your faith. Like everything is working together. All of these pieces that make you who you are and make you what you are never have to be hidden when you go into other spaces. And that's when I feel whole, when I feel like I'm never shedding pieces of myself to enter different spaces in my life.
When I think of that image of wholeness, I think of when Jesus welcomes the children and tells his disciples that the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these, and the way that the kids are, when they're in that supportive and nurturing environment, when they're free to explore and they're free to create and they're free to make friends and make mistakes and forgive each other and do so from that place of safety, right? That wholeness of just being and celebration and living without fear that somebody's going to tell you you're less than, without fear that you're not living up to something, that wholeness that comes from knowing how loved you are, and that it's not just a generic word for the whole community. Oh, you are loved, because then, well, I'm just one in the crowd and you don't really know my details, and if you knew my details, maybe you wouldn't say that. But the love that actually knows you at the root, that wholeness that springs up from that love that casts out all fear, so that you can flourish. It's got to be rooted in that love.
In my tradition, wholeness is what we already are. It's something that we were created to be. Uh, when humans are created in Genesis, the writers say humanity became a living soul, created from source materials of the dust and breathed in the breath of God, and that creature becomes a living soul. It's already a whole composed of different pieces, but it's already a whole. And so when I think of wholeness, I'm not thinking of something that is created, I'm thinking of something that I'm reclaiming in a society that prefers me to be fragmented. So I'm reclaiming what God originally created and blessed. And as a community, when we talk about our communities using that metaphor of the body and the members, that too is about claiming the original wholeness of that organism, not an organization, but an organism, something that is organic, something that is alive, something that has many parts working together, something where all those constituent pieces are in inherent relationship with each other, whether or not the spleen talks to the eyes, but there's already this relationship. And so when we speak about wholeness, when I think about wholeness, I'm thinking about reclaiming that consciousness of what already exists, not imposing on something that is foreign to it. Because if I'm imposing on something that's foreign, then there's a natural reaction of pushing it away, seeing it as a threat, regarding it as an invader. But if I'm reclaiming something that is authentic, that is part of my nature, then there's no reason for resistance. And what I've seen when I think about all of these changes that we're talking about, when I frame them in terms of what already exists but needs to be uncovered, dust blown off and all of that, it's easier for people, for whatever reason, to kind of make space in their hearts for it because it's already there. And it's more about removing the barriers to experiencing it, fully experiencing it, than setting up a new context where it can emerge. If it's already there, if we're already whole, then what do I need? What conditions do I need to set up where that can naturally level up? That's really it.
I think that, in a sense, the church has not been whole since Jesus Christ went up and sat at the right hand of the Father. I think that I like to draw when thinking about wholeness from my Jewish siblings and think of the concept of tikkun olam, of the restoration of the world. And to me, wholeness in the church looks like when we are all finally on the same page, working with the same objective, working for this restoration of all things. And interestingly, a rabbi friend of mine shared with me that Tikkun Olam was not about the end. It was not that they thought that one day the restoration of the world was coming. That is not part of their tradition. But it was about the process. And today I've been talking a lot about confession, and I believe that part of that wholeness process, about that Tikkun Olam, of that restoration for all of us, may look like forgiveness. May look like when we come finally around the table and we are forgiven and we forgive, and do it without limitations, with grace, just like Jesus has done it for us.
For me, I always see wholeness sort of as an understanding or an embracing or a loving of yourself, and understanding that you're also in this loving, embracing relationship with God, and getting to be in a loving, embracing relationship with the rest of the world, the neighbor. And so having this secure sense of who we are puts us in relationship with other people, and that's the wholeness, is that we can be authentically ourselves, knowing that that authentic self is the one that will be fostering the relationship from the God who has created us and knows us and loves us, and with the rest of the community out there that also is created and known and loved by God. And that, I think, is what tends to give us that sense of wholeness.
I think we just lost Emmy.
I think the last thing on our list of things to do this evening was to pray.
Okay.
And who had our closing prayer in the midst of this holy conversation and the work ahead of us?
I did.
Amen.
Let us pray together. Amado Dios y Padre bueno, te damos gracias porque tu misericordia se derrama sobre nosotros. Y te pedimos que tú utilices nuestras manos como obra tuya para la transformación de los espacios. Utiliza nuestras voces para denunciar la injusticia, utiliza nuestros pies para caminar con los pobres. Y que en todo lo que hagamos podamos reflejar tu amor hacia nosotros y tu perdón y reconciliación para con la humanidad. En el nombre poderoso de Jesús oramos. Amén.
Amén.
Welcome back, Amy. We just were led in prayer.
Great. We're still live, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. My apologies. Can we close too with did we get to talk about resources while I was gone? Not yet. Okay. Can we just talk quickly? You know, we've sparked a lot of conversation both among us and with those who've been watching at home and through many other sources. What resources do you encourage people to check out? We already know, obviously, we want to lift up Reconciling Works and the Reconciling in Christ Project. We want to lift up the resources from GLAD and the Naming Project. What other resources would you want each other and our audience to walk away from this conversation with today?
I'd like to lift up two, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, the taskforce.org, and also the Open and Affirming Coalition of the United Church of Christ, which is openandaffirming.org.
If you are a roster leader in the ELCA, or if you are wondering about becoming a roster leader, I want to really lift up the work of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries and the community of Proclaim. You can reach them at elm.org, I believe, and I'm checking that. Yep, elm.org, and you can communicate with them through email. It is a phenomenal community. They do retreats, really an amazing place to have that mutual consolation.
The project that I mentioned in one of my responses was called Enough Room at the Table, and the website for that is enoughroompfilm.com. And you can reach out to me on Twitter if you want more information about it. I think it would be particularly helpful for the person who was from the LCMS context and wanted to figure out what action they could take. It focuses on creating respectful dialogue in the local congregational context. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you for those who joined us at home. Thank you all for being with us. We'll close the video. Usually the Google Hangouts through YouTube can be hosted on YouTube later. I think that's the intent for ELCA Young Adults, to save this and be able to make it accessible for further review and consideration and conversation. So I hope if you're watching this at a later date that you find those resources affirming and helpful. And I hope that you all continue in a good evening and a good week and a good life and finding peace and hope and that great flourishing that we are all looking for. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.